2025 inspection report on HMP Winchester by HM Chief Inspector of Prisons paints a disturbing picture of a prison in profound crisis. Despite some isolated areas of improvement, the overall conditions at the prison, particularly in the men's closed site, were described as shocking, with many issues persisting for years without resolution. The inspection team found that fundamental aspects of safety, decency, and rehabilitation were consistently neglected, and efforts to implement meaningful reform had either stalled or failed altogether. One of the most severe findings relates to violence and self-harm. The report reveals an appalling level of violence among prisoners and towards staff, with many serious incidents taking place in a climate of fear and unpredictability. Violence reduction strategies were superficial or non-existent. The prison did not have a working action plan to tackle the problem, and frontline officers lacked the training, support, and leadership to respond effectively. Self-harm was also on the rise, exacerbated by poor mental health care and a regime that kept many prisoners locked in their cells for 22 to 23 hours per day in squalid and degrading conditions. The physical state of the prison itself was described as dire. Living conditions in the older parts of the prison were grim, unsanitary, and in some cases degrading. Inspectors found blocked toilets, broken furniture, stained bedding, mouldy walls, and infestations. Many cells were not fit for human habitation, with some prisoners sharing tiny, filthy spaces without access to basic hygiene or sufficient ventilation. The prison's inability to provide clean clothing, towels, or regular showers added to the sense of neglect and humiliation. These problems were not new. Many had been documented in previous inspections, yet little had been done to address them. Staffing was another critical weakness. The report highlighted that a significant proportion of staff were inexperienced, untrained, or operating without effective supervision. Turnover remained high, and the workforce lacked continuity. Many officers were simply unable to manage the complex challenges of a high-need, high-risk population. Staff morale was low, and there was a clear disconnect between senior leadership and frontline workers. The prison's leadership had changed several times in recent years, contributing to a sense of instability and drift. Many staff interviewed by inspectors expressed frustration, burnout, and a lack of faith in senior managers' ability to improve the jail. The prison regime was among the most impoverished in the country. Purposeful activity was virtually non-existent for the vast majority of prisoners. At the time of the inspection, more than 60% of inmates were unemployed and locked up for most of the day. Education, training, and work opportunities were severely limited, with even the few existing classes underattended due to staffing shortages and poor communication. The lack of meaningful activity led to boredom, frustration, and further behavioral problems, fueling a vicious cycle of instability and non-compliance. Even the prison library was barely accessible, with restrictions and cancellations preventing inmates from making regular use of it. Rehabilitation and release planning were equally underwhelming. Too many prisoners were released directly from closed conditions into the community without adequate preparation or support. Key aspects of sentence planning were neglected, and some prisoners were unaware of their release arrangements until the last minute. Coordination between prison departments and external agencies was poor, and information sharing was inconsistent. As a result, many prisoners left custody without stable accommodation, employment, or access to healthcare or mental health services, a recipe for failure and reoffending. A rare bright spot in the report was the situation in the adjacent open prison, HMP Winchester West Hill, which provided a much better environment. Prisoners there had significantly greater access to work, training, and time out of cell, and staff-prisoner relationships were more positive. However, this success story stood in stark contrast to the conditions on the main site and did little to offset the overall failures identified by the inspection team. The inspectorate concluded that HMP Winchester required urgent and radical intervention. Despite repeated warnings and multiple previous inspections highlighting similar failings, the prison had continued to decline. The lack of effective leadership, poor staff development, and deteriorating conditions pointed to a culture of complacency and crisis management rather than long-term strategic reform. At its core, the report serves as a scathing indictment of a prison system unable or unwilling to meet basic standards of decency and safety. It questions the purpose of incarceration when the institutions meant to hold people are themselves dysfunctional, harmful, and devoid of hope. Without urgent action, both at the operational and policy level, HMP Winchester risks becoming not just a failing prison, but a symbol of systemic collapse within the wider justice system. A man who poured boiling water over a fellow inmate at Winchester Prison before beating and raping him has been jailed for 12 years. Robert Reynolds, 29, had denied grievous bodily harm with intent, 2 counts of rape and a sexual assault. A jury at Salisbury Crown Court found him guilty of all offences following a 5-day trial. The court heard that Reynolds attacked the victim, a man who was in his 20s at the time, in July 2021, when they were prisoners at HMP Winchester in Romsey Road. Mr. Reynolds threw boiling water from a kettle at the victim, causing burns to his back and face. He then punched and kicked the victim before raping and sexually assaulting him, the jury was told. The victim was initially treated at the prison before being taken for treatment at a specialist burns unit in the hospital. He later disclosed the sexual offences. On Wednesday, December the 13th, Mr. Reynolds, currently of HMP Bullingdon, was jailed for 12 years following a hearing at Winchester Crown Court. Speaking after the hearing, Detective Sergeant Harry Wilson said, "This was a horrific attack on a vulnerable man in a prison. While the victim has since left prison, he continues to deal with the physical and mental impact of what happened to him. This was a difficult and long investigation, and I hope this shows that we will work closely with the prison to investigate any criminal offences that occur there." A convicted killer who carried out Britain's first fatal acid attack has sparked a wave of concern over prison radicalisation after launching what he described as a jihadi-inspired attack inside HMP Winchester. General Imioru, also known by his previous name, General Webster, was already serving a 17-year sentence for killing 47-year-old nurse Joanne Rand in 2018 when he lured prison officers into his cell by pretending to need help. Lying on the floor to trigger a welfare response, he ambushed the staff with a homemade weapon. He was quickly overpowered before causing any injury. But what followed was deeply alarming. Imioru reportedly told the officers that what they had just witnessed was an attempted jihadist terror attack. The incident, which occurred on February 13th, is now under investigation. While Hampshire police have not formally confirmed the nature of the attack, officials and insiders say the event has added fuel to mounting concerns about unchecked extremism inside British prisons. Imioru had no known ties to extremist ideology when he was first jailed, but sources say he began showing signs of radicalisation behind bars, reportedly displaying an increased interest in jihadism and seeking contact with known terrorist prisoners. He had already racked up multiple convictions for violence while in custody, including grievous bodily harm and the vile act of throwing urine at a female prison officer. This incident follows close on the heels of a brutal terror attack at HMP Whitemoor in January 2020, when 2 inmates wearing fake suicide belts seriously injured 5 officers using makeshift blades. One of those attackers, Rustam Ziamani, was a convicted ISIS supporter previously jailed for plotting a beheading attack. He had reportedly run Sharia courts from his cell and played a role in radicalising other prisoners. Former prison governor Ian Atchison, who led a government-commissioned review of Islamist extremism in jails in 2016, called for immediate action. He accused the Ministry of Justice of burying the scale of the problem and ignoring the growing threat. "More evidence of the prison extremism threat is emerging daily," he said. "The scale is underreported. The threat is not being managed. We must have immediate, decisive action." He praised the quick reactions of staff at HMP Winchester, stating they likely prevented a catastrophe. According to the latest figures, 224 prisoners are currently serving time for terror-related offences in the UK, the vast majority for Islamist extremism. However, as many as 800 inmates are under some level of monitoring for suspected radicalization. Officers working inside high-security facilities say the real number may be far higher and that the system is simply overwhelmed. One officer, speaking anonymously, described the radicalization process. You've got someone doing 5 or 6 years for drugs or robbery, and by the time they leave, they've been convinced the West is evil and jihad is their destiny. There are people walking out more dangerous than they were coming in. General Imeyuru's history was already marked by violence and destruction before his supposed jihadist awakening. At age 19, during a gang-related altercation, he unleashed a corrosive substance during a dispute, unintentionally dousing nurse Joanne Rand. She later died from complications related to the burns, having been attacked while mourning at her daughter's grave. Just months later, he was involved in another acid incident at a West London cinema, again injuring a bystander. In custody, his violent conduct continued. He was eventually segregated for repeated assaults on officers, but even that isolation didn't prevent his descent into extremism. Despite recommendations in Mr. Acheson's 2016 report calling for more separation units to isolate the most radical prisoners, only one of 3 such centres is currently operational. The Ministry of Justice insists measures are in place to prevent the spread of extremism, claiming that staff are trained to identify and manage radicalisation. But frontline staff and prison watchdogs say the crisis is deepening and current systems are not enough. The government's recent legislative response has focused on keeping convicted terrorists inside longer. Emergency laws passed without a Commons vote now block automatic early release for those convicted of terror offences, but critics argue that without robust de-radicalisation strategies, more time inside just means more time to recruit and radicalise others. The case of General Imeyuru, young, violent, once unconnected to extremism, underscores how the crime-terror nexus is no longer a theoretical risk. It's playing out in real time inside British prisons, with consequences that could extend far beyond the walls.